But to my immediate right is Michael Hansen, who's the CEO of Cengage Learning. To his right is Ted Mitchell, who's the president of the American Council on Education, former U.S. Undersecretary of Education. To his right is Ann Kirshner, who's a professor at the City University of New York and former dean of the Honors College there, among many other things that she's done before that. And we'll, again, let her talk about that. To her right is Daniel Jamil, who's the founder and CEO of Ooh La La Mobile. And to his right is Bob Johnson, who's the president and CEO of the American College of Financial Services. Before we start, I just want to take a quick, get a quick sense of who all of you are. So raise your hands if you work within higher education, at an institution of higher education. Of you, professor, faculty versus administrator? Okay. Work at a higher education, a company that serves higher education? Okay, that helps us understand who we're talking to. Investor, okay. Other things? Quick shout out. What anybody else do? What does somebody else do that was worth us knowing about? Okay, forget it. So a couple other quick things. We're going to have microphones for people to ask questions later, but if you feel like actively engaging, feel free to come up and write your question on the whiteboard there. There are markers there. And so at this point, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and I'll start with Michael here, to sort of talk about how they come, briefly, about how they come at this conversation, a little bit more background on themselves. And I asked them to sort of also start by saying, on that continuum, among one of the questions that helps place people on a continuum is, of the roughly 3,500 colleges and universities, traditional colleges and universities in the country, how many of them will disappear through closure or merger by 2030?
You want me to start with that one?
Well, as part of your introduction, you can add that at the end if you'd like.
Okay. Thanks, Doug. I'm Michael Hansen. I'm the CEO of Cengage Learning. And, by way of introduction, I would just simply say that the answer to a very provocative question that you started with, for me, is really around it depends. And it depends largely on whether people are willing to make the necessary changes. I find it fascinating, and I was not born and raised in the education industry, but what I've learned is that it's full of very, very smart people who like to talk. And that leads to lots of conferences and lots of talk about all the things that change. And then they love to latch on to something that, is going to change the world forever and very quickly. And then you look back and you say, Jesus, for 100 years, very little has changed in education. Why would now everything change overnight? And, I can name numerous examples. Remember the time 5 years ago, everybody said MOOCs are going to kill every institution that's out there, going to kill every publisher that is out there, and they're just going to make the world a much better place. Where are they today? Adaptive learning, same thing. So I think it's very important, and that was one of the reasons that I really wanted to join this conversation, is that we dig a lot deeper into this. So, I fundamentally believe if you're not willing to change and adapt in this market, you will disappear. You will disappear, that's a given. But I do think there are many opportunities for people to change, because the fundamental principle that education is a gateway to a better job, a better life, and frankly an important part of closing the gap in terms of the wealth of this country, where there's a significant gap in the middle, as we all know, that drives a lot of dysfunctionality right now, is, in my judgment, not debatable, that this is absolutely necessary. But how we get at it, I think, is very important, that the constituent parts, and that includes us, are challenging the way they do business and are fundamentally prepared to make sometimes very painful changes. And I'd be happy to go into some examples of what we do.
Am I guessing you're not going to throw out a number?
No, because I think the number is a good headline, but it doesn't make for a really thoughtful conversation. And I really, truly believe that, the number is irrelevant. The question is, will these institutions be willing to take the painful steps of change?
Right. Okay. Ted?
Great to see all of you. Great to be on this panel. Doug, thanks for pulling us together. I think it's going to be fun. One of the things that I learned this morning in reading my Inside Higher Education morning brief is that women are underrepresented on academic panels.
Excuse me.
So
I wonder, are they, technically this isn't an academic panel, this is a corporate panel as we...
That's even worse.
you're starting to sound like an academic. I'm happy to put my seat up for a bid if anybody would like to come right on up and take my place. But I'll give the warm up back. I've been in this work for my whole career in different guises. And what drew me to the work and what continues to motivate the work is, Doug, what you mentioned, and Michael, what you mentioned, the importance of education in American society as a vehicle of opportunity and of access to that opportunity. And so whether it was, I started out as a full-time regular old faculty member, moved into administration, wandered around the countryside doing a little bit of both for a time, decided at one point, I was a college president, and decided that I was, along with other college presidents in the same high schools, recruiting the same three excellent Latino and African American students, and that I ought to spend some time on the K-12 side of the ball, and spent 10 years, I know many of you from this life, 10 years investing philanthropic dollars in education startups aimed at improving outcomes for low-income and students of color. Back in higher education, in the policy world, in the U.S. Department of Education, we can talk a little bit about that later, and now proudly representing 1,900 of those 3,500 institutions of higher education at the American Council on Education. So what do I think about where we're headed? So I may be the Pollyanna on the panel, and we'll see. I think that on the side of being sort of a critic, I think that if you sort of go through Doug's provocative opening statement, I think that America has the finest higher education institutions in the world. We continue to import students, despite efforts to stop that. We continue to import students. We continue to export knowledge production at a huge rate. In talking, when I was in the department, in talking with ministers of education around the world, none of them would trade their finest institution or compare their finest institution against any of the top 100 in the U.S. I think, though, that we've got a really bad system of higher education in this country. And so while we've got great institutions, we've got a lousy system. And part of the reason for the lousy system is actually one of its strengths, is that it's a very diverse sector, and it should be diverse. Institutions should have independence, but I think that there are ways that we need to act more like a system if we're going to make this shift and survive. So where are we? I think as a membership organization, I'm happy to predict that there will be 4,217 institutions of higher education, no more, no less, at the end of the time period that we're looking at. Why? Because I think the word, Doug, in your question, that is the pivot is traditional. And I think that if we could take that word out, and if institutions could start to look just at the incredible market of students who are not, they're post-traditional learners. The 20-year-old returning veteran, the 30-year-old single mom, the displaced worker, that's the future of American higher education. And if we can make that shift, that market is substantial. 36 million people have some college and no degree. Guess what? They started out believing that they were going to get a college degree. And so there are markets there aplenty for us to do the work that we've set out to do to create opportunity for Americans at all stages of their lives.
The one quibble is, and I think you and I have talked about this, I actually think we have a non-system of higher education. We have an ecosystem,
That's right.
but not a system, and I think we could maybe talk about that. So anyway, Ann, go ahead.
So if Ted is Pollyanna, I think I'm closer to Cassandra. Not that I think the sky is falling. I have to laugh when I see the word professor on my credential here. I have to laugh because I did start out to be a professor decades ago, and then left academics completely and worked in media and technology for those decades, and then came back into education through the world of online learning. And so I am sort of living proof that with a liberal arts degree, you can do lots of things, including 5 happy years at the National Football League. So on the other hand, Clay Christensen says, 50% of the institutions are going to go out of business. Moody's says 10% now of small colleges are at an operating deficit. So truth lies somewhere in between there, and I think we're going to see lots of different kinds of relationships develop between colleges. The ones who are going to fail because they don't understand that they need to graduate their students or provide them with different kinds of credentials, that it's not simply a diploma, but a credential that in some ways helps a student towards a job. And something that I think both Ted and Michael have touched on, that credentials are changing, that lifelong learning is really the name of the game. And so it can't be that as soon as you finish your college degree, it begins to depreciate. It has to appreciate and move in the opposite direction. I'm a New York City native. I'm so glad that New York is the home of EdTech, the center of the universe for EdTech. I went to public school right up through college, and I guess I see some of these questions through the lens of the 3 institutions that I've been very close to, and I'm probably a Venn diagram of one, because I've been part of the City University of New York for the last 12 years, 500,000 students, largest urban institution in the United States. Princeton University, where my graduate degree is from and where I'm a recently joined member of the Board of Trustees, and Apollo Education, where I was a long-time board member. So I'm probably the only person who fits into that Venn diagram. Higher education is absolutely essential, but I think one of the things we should talk about is the willingness, the obstacles to higher education to change.
Daniel.
Yeah, so I guess I can give you a headline. I would say probably 20 to 25%, meeting certain criteria and conditions. Some of them were discussed. The one thing that I do want to point out is also looking at the context around us, right? What is changing and what is shifting? The internet was a big change, right? It really opened up information flow, allowed us to do a lot of things before we had to go to a library. Research was centralized in universities. It changed a lot of things. At the same time, questions are coming in around new technologies like, automation, AI. There's a lot of skill sets that are just going to be taken over. The question is, can smaller community colleges or trade schools, can they adapt to that, right? So that is a question. The other question I just want to provoke everyone to ask or think about is, when we say, or when we talk about university, what is the role of a university, right? Is the role of a university to simply provide a career and match that? Or does it go beyond that? Does it go deeper than that? And I was actually having a conversation with a vice provost of an Ivy League recently, and he kind of mentioned a very interesting way, which is universities are sort of this transition period of youth into adults, right? This is kind of like this safe place where they come in, they learn a lot of skills. They're the first time they're outside of their parents' kind of safe zone. They're making mistakes. They're learning new things. They're interacting in a team environment. And these are very important skills for adults to be citizens. And so they do see that whole experience part of university as a really important role. Now, can that be digitized and replicated? I don't know. But I think that's a really important part to consider. So I'll give a bit of a background about sort of what we do, because I think it fits into the narrative. So we provide, or we help universities all across, I would say in 7 countries now, better engage their students, through the one device that Gen Z and millennials, are stuck to, which is a mobile device. So we centralize all their information, from the time they get up, when they're accessing the grades or booking a study room, or want to see their laundry. Everything is digitized. So we get to see a lot of interesting trends of how students are actually engaging, what are they asking, what are they talking about. And you will be surprised. I mean, I'll share the data as the conversation goes on, but you'll be surprised of how, well, there is a disconnect between how the students view and how the university and the institution's viewing. And I feel like students need to be part of that conversation. They're a very important stakeholder as well. And we're not doing enough of that.
Okay, Bob.
I took a little different route to get where I am. I started out as a faculty member at a traditional university. Then I moved into the professional credentialing space. I ran the Chartered Financial Analyst program for 20 years. The CFA program is a global credential that is delivered at a very low price point and has global cachet. And I think that's one of the things that when I look to the future of higher education, I don't think it's any different than any other area of commerce. I think scale is really going to matter. I think, you know, it's the effect of Amazon a little bit. But I think the quote about how many institutions are going to survive, the quote that brings this to mind with me is a quote, investor concern over the threat of new technologies is overrated. Folks, that was from the 1999 Blockbuster annual report. And I think higher education would be wise to pay heed to that and not fall into that trap. And I agree about the inaction. People talk about it a lot. It's the old line, you know, when all is said and done, more is said than is done. And, you know, I think that's going to spur higher education. Hopefully it'll spur higher education to action. But what I would say is I'm more in the camp of 20 to 25% of institutions will
Okay, so actually before we, and I totally take Michael's point that, you know, I don't want to engage in oversimplification, but actually I think these numbers helped give a sense of where people were and just to throw mine out, since I asked the question, I'm very much a moderate on this question. I think Clay Christensen's theory does not apply, and nearly as much to higher education, which is a much more, I think it apply. If higher education was purely about delivering content, Clay Christensen's theory would apply a great deal. It doesn't, I think. But anyway, so I'm put mine in the 200 to 250, which is roughly 4 to 7%, I would say. So and mostly small, private, and regional public are the categories. So just curious, sort of quick show of hands. Probably easier to do percentages. Let's see, under 5% of institutions, hands raised? Yeah, that's the lowest. 5 to 10%? 10 to 20%? And more than 20%? Okay, so it was probably I would say the average was probably in the high teens, maybe to 20. Okay, so interesting. So I guess following on some of the things that were said there, is higher education, so part of the reason I believe that the number is going to be smaller is that I actually think the history of higher education shows that it is a much more adaptable industry and enterprise than it is historically. It is often given credit for. We've seen whole sectors created out of whole cloth, now often with government help and government prodding by the community colleges, but we've seen for-profit sector rise up. So that's kind of part of why I think there's an easy critique that nothing's changed in 100 years. I know you're talking about certain aspects of it, but I actually think you look and see lots of change. The reason it is difficult to get systemic change in a non-system, which I think is part of the problem. But I'm curious, sort of, Michael, maybe start with you in terms of why do you believe change comes so slowly, or I think your sense is that it's too slowly, or at least possibly too slowly. So why do you believe change has happened as slowly as it does in this enterprise, and why do you think it needs to speed up change? If I read what you said, heard what you said right.
Yeah, no, I think you heard it right, and I do think that the primary reason that change comes so slowly is that the status quo is so comfortable for a lot of people. Exactly. And that, you know, sort of getting out of that comfort zone, unless you get really forced to get out of that comfort zone, doesn't come easy to people. And I think it's very human. I'm not criticizing people for it. But I do think that that is a fundamental reason that we're seeing change happening so slowly. I want to come back to sort of in my mind, a rallying cry around sort of really focusing on the student and really focusing on what the student is experiencing. And I do believe that I'm cognizant of the fact that we are at a tech conference, but the reality, I think, if you talk to students today, is what they want is access and affordability. This is really about access and affordability. And I think we are well served by thinking through this in our own business model, and we as an industry, meaning the traditional publishing industry, was one of the worst offenders. I mean, we put out books for like $250. That's obscene. That's an obscene price point. And then we asked them to, keep buying more and more. And I do think this, to me, is an example of where you can make the pivot, and we have taken it to heart. We've made a big pivot. We're offering now a subscription service to all the content that you can get for one simple per semester price that is under $120.
Bravo.
Everything, all you can eat.
It's really great.
It's a risk, but it's, in my mind, a risk worth taking exactly for the reasons that I described before. I don't think students are suffering, with all due respect, from the absence of more technology. Just give me some more gadgets, or give me some more features and functionalities. They're saying, give me something that works. Okay, number one, give me something that works and something that's affordable.
Is it, Michael? Is it fair to say? And again, I think I speak on this topic with some authority, not because I know higher education that well, but my industry, like Michael's, has been through the change that. So, is it fair to say that your pivot was to what extent do you feel that your pivot was also because of the industry? You felt compulsion to change too, correct? As a company and as an industry.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to take
I'm
serious,
just
everybody.
On your point about the only change when we need to, which is or when we have to some extent.
It is, and we've been through a painful period in the sense that since we overstayed the welcome in the business model for so long, we went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We had to get the company out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We had to transition into the new world of technology and embed the technology in the content and all of that. Yeah. But I firmly believe you cannot run around, and every CEO tends to do this, and say, oh, we're so customer focused, and then you're not following what the primary concern of the customer is. So unless you embrace that, I don't think you really will, over the long term, survive.
Mm-hmm. So others to respond, do you believe that higher education, that and I always am loath to, since there aren't that many practitioners in the room, I always loathe to say that there hasn't been enough pain for most institutions so far, which is part of why we haven't seen, I think, fast change at least. But so how do you attribute it, Ted?
Yeah, so I would just add to a couple of things that Michael said, and congratulations to Cengage on this new model. I think it's really, really promising. And when we think about access and affordability, increasingly we understand the costs of ancillary materials. I guess textbooks aren't really ancillary, but it's a good job. I would say that two other reasons that higher education has been slow to change. One is that we have, as a society, maybe even more than as a non-system, we've been very unclear about what the outcome goals are. And unless you know where you're trying to get, any road will lead you there. And I think we've got a bit of that problem in higher education.
And it's also been harder to judge.
And that's one of the reasons, is that it's super hard to judge something like education that has a social development aspect to it, intellectual development aspect to it, and a very long tail. At what point do you begin to measure? Even if we knew exactly what we wanted, when would we start to do that? Which is one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this, one of the reasons why I think certifications along the way are really interesting ways of thinking about aggregating outcomes and not having to solve the whole big problem. So I think that's one. The second one, and I'm sorry I'm going to sound like a organizational theorist, and I was once. There has been a sort of isomorphism within higher education around a specific model of success that doesn't put students first. And whether you go to a liberal arts college in Iowa or to a regional comprehensive, or even to some community colleges, they all want to do the same thing. They all want to up their research productivity and
student selectivity, right?
And their student selectivity. And so you end up with this really bizarre dynamic in which the fewer students you take and the less time your faculty spends with them, the better your institution is. And it's really hard to get from where they are to a place where we would admire, unless there's enough pain or enough exogenous challenge to the system to be able to get there.
So that's the opposite of scale. You know, we have a system. We're
descaling.
We're descaling. You know, exclusivity. Brands were built. Higher education brands were built on the number of people they excluded, and the more they excluded, the better. One of the many things I've admired that Michael Crow has done at Arizona State is to basically turn that formula on its head and say we want to be judged by the number of students we include rather than exclude. So a couple of things. You know, I don't want to bash faculty, but I will say, as a follow-on to what Ted was saying, that I do believe that faculty governance, shared governance, and the slowness to adapt curriculum is part of the problem. I was talking the other day to somebody about how library science schools have disappeared. And now there's tremendous interest in data science being an archivist within an organization, managing data within an organization. Schools of library science didn't adapt, and yet there was a market, you know, waiting to be developed that they sort of missed. I think the pain point is coming, and I think the pain point is coming because of employers. You know, something like 80 or 85% of college freshmen these days say they're going to college to get a job. And we could argue about all the reasons, you know, college does so much more than prepare you for a job. But God help us if we take students' money, their families' money, and then don't get them fit for a job. There is something wrong with that. And until recently, we could be fat, dumb, and happy in higher education because a college degree was a simple proxy for potential. If you got a college degree, well, you were fit to go to work in the eyes of an employer. But increasingly, as employers are using technology and searching through resumes with algorithms that determine whether students have certain skills that they are looking for, you're beginning to see some companies like Ernst & Young and IBM and others, Google, others, that are taking BA or BS off their job descriptions because that crude proxy of the diploma is no longer the only measurement for success. And as those skills become, as those technologies become more advanced, employers are going to be able to back solve to see, well, what sort of student preparation will be the sort that we need. And if it leads up to a college degree, that's great. But short of a college degree may be okay too. So I'm not saying I want that to happen, but it's already beginning to happen. And I think it's the biggest danger that higher education could possibly face, and that is losing the confidence of employers.
I agree with that, with a caveat, which is that I think certainly right now, the number of employers that know what they're looking for and can define it well enough is tiny. And I think the employers themselves have not figured out what they're looking for. And that's why I think, again, that's why I argue this is going to be slower change than the fantabulous predict.
And a lot of the employers say, you know, it's soft skills. We want leadership skills. We want communication. I think that's like the polls that ask people what they watch on television. Right. And they say National Geographic and public television, and in the meantime they're watching Survivor and Chopped, you know. So anyway.
So anyway, I think that's
Doug,
the caveat I put on. Bob,
if I could just add here, I think there's an analogy here to my former employer, CFA Institute, in terms of what are employers looking for. Employers in the fund management industry, if you will, financial professionals, go to the CFA program and prefer people that went through the CFA program. The price point was $2,500, by the way, as opposed to an MBA that could be well over $100,000 from prestigious university, because they knew what they were getting. And that's the scale part. I think one of the things that employers have difficulty with is there certainly is a signal of quality from certain universities, but people don't know exactly what programs, exactly what knowledge those people that come from other schools, what they get. So I think one of the things that I see is, I think the catalyst is the student loan problem, is that that's going to demand that higher education change, because people are now questioning, it isn't just, okay, am I going to go to college and I'm going to jump in and fund college by getting into debt, because there are all these horrible stories of people that are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and living with their families.
And there are about 12 of them in the country.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the big catalyst, I think, and that's where specialized education and credentialing and stacking credentials, I think there's a huge future in that.
Yeah, I just want to vehemently agree and with what you said about losing the confidence of the employer, but I would position that actually there's some work to be done, and in fact we're doing some of this work to match learning objectives to job skills.
Yes.
Right? I mean, one of the reasons that they don't know what they're looking for is they don't know what they're looking for, how that relates to what gets taught. Right? So there is a systematic approach that we're now taking to link those two in a way that they can truly then search. And this is part, I think, of our obligation as a system or non-system to actually make it more transparent. Whereas before, I think, and I think, Ted, you said it very well, the objective was, I want to graduate as many students, I want to select as few as I possibly can and graduate as many. Well, that's not really the objective of what you're trying to do.
Daniel, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think I'll add to that, because part of what we're trying to help colleges and universities is to help them assess their learning objectives. And from our data sets, we've seen some universities and colleges do a good job. For example, Case Western or McGill up in Canada, they've pretty much mapped out all of their outside of the classroom programming to actual learning objectives. But the majority of these schools and institutions we work with, they have no idea, right? And they cannot even assess it. So how do you assess? I think the bigger problem is, how do you assess that a student has actually learned this objective? I think that's the bigger problem. And going back to the original question, I think it's a matter of two simple points: input and output. Universities should be aligned with outcomes and output. At the end of the day, if a student is taking a loan and they're paying for tuition, if it's not free, they're going to demand a job and a career, for sure. I mean, that's the point of universities, so we should align to that. But also, we should be aware of inputs. Not all students who are coming in are the same, right? They are students from, low-income communities. Their high schools do not give you the same skill sets. In fact, there was a doctor who graduated from Harvard University, and he gave the case that he was the only African American in his batch when he went to the Chicago Med School, and the reason he chose his college versus going to a better school was certain colleges designed to help you catch up. He did not learn basic biology. A lot of the things that his peers were taught, he just did not know. And so there's certain schools and colleges that kind of help you adapt and make up for that. So I think inputs also matter, because not all students are the same.
Well, you're also, that's the thing, even the language you're using, fewer than half of students today are high school are coming out of high school. That's the thing. Part of why the reason this conversation has gotten so complex is because a lot of people out there and certainly out there broadly still think of 18-year-olds, and that's just not what this enterprise is as much designed to do anymore. So I want to ask about there are sort of four main critiques of higher education that I think are certainly we're hearing a lot about these days. And one is sort of affordability, and it's the sort of prices and debt problem that Bob was talking about, the sort of outcomes and whether students are emerging from institutions with the skills that they need to function in society, and certainly, and most of all, I think, in the workforce. Access, and whether institutions are, whether people, the fact that you are still much likelier, 5 times likelier to have a college to get a bachelor's degree if you're a rich dumb kid than if you're a poor, smart kid. I mean, those data are real. And the last, and this is emergent, I think, particularly in the last couple of years, is the sort of culture and politics critique that higher education is a decreasingly accepting of alternative viewpoints. And I think that's been probably the biggest driver in the last couple of years of the sharp change and decline in Republican support for higher education, which we've seen a lot of attention about. So I'm curious, I want to ask each of you sort of which of these do you believe is the most legitimate criticism and which one is the most exaggerated? Anne, maybe start with you.
I think one of the things that I observed and lived really over my years running the Honors College at CUNY was seeing the incredible pressures and stress that particularly first-generation low-income students experience in college. And with all due respect to what happens in the classroom, the envelope around the classroom, the ability to have enough food to eat to get through the day, the security of knowing where you're going to sleep that night, the juggling of work and family and school. That whole package of life really guts sort of everything that happens in college. And you're probably familiar with CUNY's ASAP program, which has become a national model for how you surround community college students with enough support mechanisms to help them. I think academic and career advising, those are the unsung heroes of colleges these days, and we do a lousy job, particularly at career advising, where most people who work in a career center and certainly faculty have not worked outside of the university and wouldn't have a clue what the 21st century marketplace is looking at. I exaggerate slightly, but only a little. So I'm not sure how that fits into your categories, but let's just recognize that the Ivy Leagues educate 1% of American college students. The other 99% are going to mostly public institutions, and increasingly it's that first generation low-income student that has to be served. And the only way to make progress there, in addition to all the other things we've been talking about, is to figure out that support service part and help students succeed.
Bob?
Yeah, I think two of your categories are intertwined, and that's access and affordability. If we look at higher education, it's hard. I'm hard pressed to say it's a meritocracy. Some people are born on third base and think they hit a triple. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with higher education. And I think the affordability measure is tied to that, but is incredibly important.
Ted?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
I mean, I would just add one point to what you said, Anne, around the 1% that get trained in Ivy League schools, but they tend to be the 90% who make education policy,
Yes.
Which is interesting, right? As opposed to the people that get educated in the other 99%. But I would wholeheartly agree that access and affordability is the key challenge with this, and I do believe that the affordability, the excuse, it's sort of it gives you a better life at the end, is too generic. You need to be much more specific in terms of what is it that you're going to gain. There are clearly some aspects about education that are about, being a productive member of society, but there is a big part is like, am I going to get a job that pays and I'm going to get further, am I going to make progress in terms of my personal and financial well-being? And if somebody cannot answer that question with a straight face, then they should, ask themselves whether they're in the right industry in that respect.
And by the way, on the meritocracy point, what I mean by that is that it's more difficult to get into certain schools, much more difficult than it is to get out. The funnel is at the front end.
Yeah.
The funnel should be at the back end.
That's right.
But the funnel's at the front end. And I think that's where certification and really has a strength, because through scale, you can let virtually anybody in and have people prove their way out.
And that's Michael Crow's thesis.
Right.
Right.
So it's good that you have a diverse group here, because I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I'm going to do outcomes. I think that's the one that's critical. I don't want us to fall into the isomorphism about social status and think that access is access to the 1%. I think it's important. I think that Ivy League institutions and selective publics should do a better job of bringing more Pell eligible students, more minority students into their programs. We worked hard at that in the department, shining a positive spotlight on institutions that did a good job, and pointing out institutions that weren't quite at that average, and that needs to continue. But I'm focused on outcomes because I want the other 99%, or the 70%, or the 60% who are in public comprehensive institutions to be getting the stuff that is going to set them up for success in life. And I think the only way you do that is by focusing broadly on how those institutions can achieve strong outcomes. Thank you for mentioning the student supports that are so important, and we're understanding, whether it's at CUNY or at Georgia State or at other institutions, the analysis that you need to do, the just-in-time support that you need to do to keep a student from falling off the rails for something as simple as not having money to fix their car, to be able to get to class or find childcare for their kid. But I don't want to leave the core, the academic core, alone. I think that there's a ton that we need to do to help faculty do their jobs better. And we're learning all across the board in higher education, but one of the places where we're making the most profound learnings is in the area of pedagogy and learning science. Jonathan Gurko from ACU is here. This is what Jonathan is spending his life. This is his life's work, helping university faculty do their core teaching better. And I think all of that leads to outcomes that need to be better identified, better measured, not just at the end, but in a formative way, so that people are accumulating evidence of the work that they're doing. And then on the other side, Doug, you and I've had this conversation. While I think the cost issue is a perceptual problem, I don't think that there is a national house burning down student loan fire happening. And I think that the culture and politics thing, and to your point, if we do remember that in traditional residential institutions, we're talking about 18-year-olds who are not fully formed intellectually, politically, socially, it's gonna be messy. Yeah. And I think that mess is being used in very tactical ways to give higher rate about.
So I guess I think I tend to agree on that the outcomes are the key, because honestly, I think my personal view is that the reason we're seeing, I mean, listen, we've seen some big numbers, $1 trillion, 60,000, we've seen some big numbers that have drawn attention to the affordability crisis. I think the affordability has become an issue primarily because of doubts about the outcome.
I totally agree with that.
And it's a value.
And because so many people don't finish but still have debt.
Correct.
Exactly.
So the connection, define value in my simplistic is price plus outcome equal value, or price time. I don't know what the but it's that combination. And so I think without clear sense of what people are getting, it's not surprising. And because some number of people ended up back on their parents' couches after the recession, et cetera, I think there are a whole bunch of reasons why affordability, I mean, again, beyond the fact that it's just gotten much more expensive and grown it way past faster than inflation. But I think clear answers on outcomes wouldn't necessarily make the price stuff go away, but it would answer the question more clearly.
But Doug, I just want to connect to the point that Anna made earlier. Let's not get now into an academic discussion, what is an outcome? Yeah. The reality is outcome should be defined as employability.
Well,
there is a big employability
among
gap,
other things. That's the thing. If we define a higher education outcome purely by what happens in the market, in the job thing, I think society is, should it be the dominant decider and definer? Probably.
See, I think all those words, vocational and continuing education, and I think they're all anachronistic. I think we need to reinvent those categories, because the argument that we shouldn't be educating for the first job, we should be educating for a career and the fifth job. Well, hell, if you don't get the first job, you're not getting the fifth job. So it really, I used to really listen. I'm the liberal arts, stalwart defender here, but if we don't find ways to educate people so that they have a degree of comfort and affluence, then I think we are doing something that erodes our democracy long term and contributes to income inequality in a way that we are all going to rue.
But so let me just ask you a question. So before you, does that mean that because that's, to me, you want. Are you okay then with a institution losing its ability to award degrees or credentials based purely on job outcomes by a certain date? Because that's where we're heading if we don't.
No, of course not.
No, but you might be, and some people. I wouldn't be surprised if there are people that are.
I would bristle against complaining that the person who chooses to work in social work, for $30,000, that the school should be penalized for turning out social workers as opposed to investment bankers. That is clearly not the direction I would personally want to go in. And the other truth is that you can do everything right and focus on all the right outcomes and not produce an employable person for reasons that have nothing to do with the school's failure. So there has to be a lot of wiggle room in there. But where we are now, employability is not even on the table. And I'm just telling you, I think that colleges, they don't want to be judged on that outcome, because they know that they haven't done a whole lot to integrate the world of work with college, whether it's apprenticeships or internships, the sort of co-op education model that Northeastern and others have pioneered. That is not what colleges have wanted to be about, and maybe in another era they could have chosen to continue not be what they're about. But I think the world has changed.
Can I back us off a little bit? So I don't disagree with the fundamental architecture, Ann, but I do think that just a couple things, right? So the wage premium for a bachelor's degree continues to hold steady at about 70%. So there's something happening, and it's not just the growth in the number of bachelor's degrees. The unemployment rate for holders of bachelor's degrees, except for the 12 people who are playing video games in their parents' basement, is 2%. So the exchange may be fraught because employers aren't getting exactly what they need and students are underemployed rather than getting jobs in field. But there's still some way in which that proxy works. Doug, I'm probably the person in the room who believes most strongly that institutions should lose their ability to have any access to federal financial aid and should shut themselves down or be shut down if they don't meet employment standards over a certain period of time. I say that with such vehemence. Some of you may have heard of the gainful employment rule. And really, I will come around this bush, I promise.
Is the head of AC supporting gainful employment applying to all institutions?
Yes.
I'm coming right around that bush, So the reason that we felt so strongly...
I'd have a story then.
That's right here. Breaking news. Student unit record comes next. The reason that I feel so strongly about that rule is that the law on which the regulation was built differentiates between training for a skill and something broader in education. I don't think that law was perfect, but it did make an important distinction. And I think that it applies to this training for a first job question. If it really is training for a first job, I think that there are bunches of our institutions that actually aren't very well equipped to do that. If it's educating for a first job, then I think those institutions need to do a better job of identifying the skills that are being taught in a way that that can be validated by some kind of third party and can then, which is where the certification world is way ahead, that can then be used by employers to do a better job of screening and scanning on the specific skills within that education. So sorry
Bob
to
and
take
then Daniel.
Well, something that was said earlier, you mentioned lifelong learning. Why does the four-year undergraduate, the typical four-year, why do they have to prepare somebody for their fifth job? In other words, why aren't you learning, why aren't you undergoing lifelong learning that helps you with that fifth job? I'm with you. I think that colleges and universities should be preparing people for their first job. But they should continue. And colleges and universities...
And universities should be built around continuing that process.
That's
right?
exactly right. Because you don't know the direction your career may take you. And there's knowledge, skills, and abilities that you may need depending on which path you go. So expecting that colleges and universities can really, truly prepare people for that fifth job is fallacious on its face, I think.
But the question then is, how informed are people at the point where they're getting that first job about, I mean, that raises the question of what the nature of that education for the first job is when you don't know what your first job is going to be. I mean, that's why the specialization that you use as your example is really much more likely to be about the third job than the first job.
It is more about the third
Yeah.
job, but the knowledge, skills, and abilities people need for their first jobs aren't that, I would contend, really aren't that different.
Well, but they're the liberal arts,
But,
arguably.
but colleges aren't, people are selecting colleges based on if they have lazy rivers instead of if they do that. And colleges and universities aren't held to account for that.
Well, but those things are hard to measure. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'll add some data to this.
We don't want to.
But from the student's perspective, right? So every year we sort of do this annual survey. It's a 2-week-long survey where we ask students a whole spectrum of different questions. And so this fall, it's 50,000 all across, from community colleges to large state to, Ivy Leagues and so on. So is career important to them? Yes, absolutely. And then when we dig deeper and when we ask them, so what are your biggest challenges right now in university, right? So the top 3 or 5 usually ranges around, time management, figuring myself out, complexity, how do you deal with the complexity of the system? And then the second one is understanding their path to success, which is kind of goes back to that. So as a student, even if I take a major in accounting or maths, if I don't have a path and understand what do I need to do inside the classroom and outside of the classroom to make sure that I can get, or high probability that I can get a job, the system is failing, right? So I just want to turn the conversation from the student perspective as well.
Go ahead,
Can I just add one other data point in terms of full disclosure? So I wasn't born in this country. I was born in Germany, and I certainly have an experience of the education system there. And while I agree, in many respects, we have a great system here, fragmented as it is, but we have a great system, or great institutions, as you said. I think that's better. It's an interesting data point that there are only 3 countries in the world where youth unemployment is lower than average unemployment. Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. The only 3 countries in the world. We never stop and think in this country why that is. And I would postulate that the reason there is, and it goes back to your point, Daniel, that there is a collaboration between the education institutions and employers that allows students to have a dual track, that they know exactly what they need in the real world because they're working in the real world every Thursday and Friday. And they're going to school every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So they know exactly what they are required to do. And I think we need to really get out. To me, it's not about, let's go to that system per se, but we need to be more open to break these mental models that we have. That, you got to go out, get a 4-year degree, get a BA, and otherwise, vocational we talk about, but nobody wants our kids to be in a vocational school, right? Nobody wants that, present company included. So I think we need to break through these models and really open up and look at a variety of different models that might work.
I'm familiar with the German model, and I think it's a really very interesting one. And I thought about it often this semester. I returned to the classroom for the first time in a very long time, and for the first time was teaching graduate students rather than undergraduates. And I frankly didn't know if I'd like it or not. I loved teaching graduate students because they knew exactly why they were there. They knew they knew the outcomes that they wanted, and they were going to hold my feet to the fire and make sure that they got them. So it's much more similar to what you're describing.
So I think tying these couple of comments together, I think that, and being the parent of a college student,
Oh, my sympathies.
thank you. The most annoying, I don't know if you all remember coming home from college or like third semester and saying that you had just declared a history major. And then, the inevitable question, well, what are you going to do with that? We actually can answer that question now. And I think one of the ways in which, and a lot of you are working on and with institutions to use data better. But this pathway question is so important. You can ask it in both directions. I think I'm really interested in this area, backwards map, what will help me get there. Alternately, I'm really interested in, my brain gets really excited about this area of study. What do I do with that? And then how can we sort of map some of the competencies?
And the thing that ties a lot of these things together, this is going to require much, much greater conversation and collaboration between employers and higher education in a way that just our non-system, talk about a non-system, we don't have a good system of that connection, and that's a deeply important one. So before, I want to turn to your questions in a minute, but since we're given the location where we are, I wanted to just at least have a brief conversation among the folks about the role of technology. There's been a lot of promising, I think, and arguably over-promising by the ed tech industry about the ability to for technology to sort of break or remold the iron triangle, which is this idea of in higher education that costs and access and outcomes are all linked, and sort of technology is often put as a way we can scale things to increase access without raising costs, et cetera. So I guess I wanted to just sort of and apologies to those of you in the audience if this conversation gets critical of ed tech, but I'm curious sort of how you view the role of technology as a game changer, as a transformer of the enterprise, or as a facilitator of or something less than that. Anne, maybe start.
I would just like to pick up and tie that question to the one we were just talking about, which is, what does a history major do? Because I think that creating those pathways that you were describing, I think that's a very intriguing and promising area for technology to be able to light up the path between a student's choice of courses and majors and internships, and then eventual outcomes in work. You think about all the data that's available now on LinkedIn. If that were more granular, and you could say, okay, so when you graduate with a history degree from Middlebury, as my son did, what happens to a student with that degree, and how could we back solve for certain kinds of careers? Oh, you want to be a museum curator, or what sort of degrees, what sort of schools produce that? So my favorite area for technology is this career pathways. And link back into the academic enterprise.
Technology as a processor and actualizer of data more than anything else, and others. Michael, since you.
I think So let me be both acknowledging and critical at the same time. I do think that the biggest impact technology will continue to have, is it actually makes learning transparent, and because it makes learning transparent, it makes it open to scientific exploration, which we had way too little of, like what really works in learning and what doesn't work in learning. That said, I think the second element is really scale. I think some of the, I think we talked about it before, there's just, you go to these conferences, whatever, ASU, GSV, et cetera, there's, a bunch of small tech companies running around, they all have the latest, greatest, et cetera. The problem is very few can actually scale it so that it really affects millions of people. So picking the things that work in a very sort of, in a very sober, scientific-based way, and then scaling it, I think will be an impact of technology that is worthwhile. But, let's stop running around and just waving our hands and saying, oh, this is the latest, greatest, without that evidence. I don't think we should
Okay,
be.
before I ask the others to comment, if you could raise your hand if you have a question, and we've got somebody who's going to come around with mics, so please, others of you want to jump in, Daniel?
Yeah, sure. I think the whole hype about education technology, and then sort of the realization something worked, something didn't. I think this is a normal part of how technology cycles work, right? Whether within education or any other sector. And in some ways, I think it is important because when you look at it from the context of foresight, innovators are trying to create a world that doesn't exist or a construct that doesn't exist. And so they see it from a very different perspective. So take the example of Google. Search engine, during the times of Yahoo, it wasn't about the search engine, it was about that central homepage where you can see everything. But now, in the context of hindsight, of course it's obvious, right? Amazon going from books to like what they're doing right now it's obvious. So I think you will have failures, that's part of technology. And I think Michael brought in a really good point, which is scalability, right? Especially in our space, right? Universities are different, they're unique. The needs of students are also, more or less different depending on, where they're coming from and their background. So building something that can actually scale is a challenge. And so I agree with Michael on that. Yeah.
Bob and then Ted.
Yeah, for most of our programs at the American College, technology is everything for us because we deliver, they're all graduate students, so they all want to be there. But where there is virtually there. In fact, if I would have known that we launched a new program today, and if I'd have known that new program was going to launch today, I would have never have agreed to serve on this panel. But the new program is basically one that uses complex simulations. It uses adaptive learning. It's really for us and in our field. And think about what our field is. We largely serve folks who work in financial services, and the average age of an insurance agent or of a financial planner is 58 years old. So think about that problem and think about we need to replace those folks. So we're developing programs that are attractive to folks that are my son's generation, who's 23, and it's gamification and all of those things. So it's really important for us.
Ted, and then we'll go to the question.
Great. So three really quick ideas. So I think, building on the last point, I think that there have been breakthroughs on the delivery side. I think that's one of the big areas where technology is making a difference. But I think the real breakthrough is not on where MOOCs were, but it's on this personalized, adaptive AI side, and I think that will continue. The second is the idea of moving to measuring actual learning rather than being subject to the big wide proxies that have so much in doubt, and I think that needs to continue to develop. But I think that the sweet spot is the really unsexy architecture around informatics and big data analysis, whether it's student pathways to careers, student pathways to the finish line with their degree or program, and really understanding those cues that we're now able to get at the student level and what's working and not working.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question here. Go ahead, you got the mic.
Hey, thanks very much for a very interesting discussion. My name's Jamie Martin. I run the first education technology accelerator on the African continent. And the question I wanted to ask was about whether you guys agreed that African students might be the saviors of US higher education. Because it's the youngest continent in the world, population is going to double, and there is a sort of desperate ambition to get out of the continent's universities and into particularly US universities. Those students are getting richer in terms of their social class, and it's becoming more accessible because of technology. So I wonder, do you agree that African students might be the solution? And secondly, how are US universities going to make a US education more accessible or more affordable for that kind of massively growing demographic?
Anybody have thoughts on that?
I was gonna go in a very different direction. Yes, they will be, but they will be because I think that in typical sort of developmental economics and technology and innovation side, sections of Africa and India will use technology more effectively to deliver education, to assess student learning, and to make that learning understandable to employers and others. And I think that progress is likely to go faster for all the reasons that we've talked about here than what we're doing in the U.S. So I have the honor of serving on the Khan Academy board. And it's very interesting to see the very different modalities that Khan is used in U.S. Classrooms and in the classrooms in developing countries. The opportunities are much broader, and I'm more confident of that than I am that U.S. universities are going to make space.
Interesting. Anybody else? Daniel?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. I can probably add more context from the Indian subcontinent. So, for example, if you look at a country like Pakistan, 65% of the population is under the age of 25, right? And they're growing. So this process is already happening. You know, you have American institutions or their brand, and they're building local institutions and driving that. So it's already happening. The other point I just want to make is that if we're thinking about African students from Africa coming into the U.S., that's still not addressing the broader access point of view, because most of the students will not be able to travel and pay and come to the U.S., right? So that's another problem to address. And the third point I want to make is that the degree matters, right? In places like India, in Pakistan, and Kenya and so on, parents will spend up to above 35-40% of their monthly income to educate their kids, because they know that is the difference between acceptance in society, getting a job and living with dignity, and not, right? So it is a very, very big deal. So I don't have all the answers for it, but I do agree that this is a big opportunity or a challenge.
Jamie, it's a resounding yes from me. When I was with CFA Institute, when I joined in 1996, 85% of the students, the candidates, were from outside, or were from North America. When I left in 2011, 70% were non-North American. I spent time in Nairobi, I spent time in Cape Town and Johannesburg presenting CFA charters to those individuals, and they earned the equivalent of a U.S. degree, because employers consider it the equivalent of a U.S. degree, for about $2,200.
That's huge.
Here.
Hi. So I got my degree 15 years ago. I was a graphic design degree, and my industry is completely different now than what it was back then. Mobile apps didn't exist. So I think about a lot of kids today wanting jobs that we don't even know exist just yet, and I think about the concept of a major and how that might change, where majors might not exist because more jobs like that are growing, new technologies are growing, where we don't know that they're going to even be there in 10 years or what's going to be there in 10 years. So maybe the concept of a major might have to change, where you have a more abstract kind of learning environment that you finish with.
Well, I think to me, the almost unmistakable transformation that we're facing, I think, is the shrinking of the unit of learning and the associated credential. That's to me the story of the next 0 to 10 years, and the question of how fast that happens. To me, the big question is to what extent higher education, as we define it now, post-secondary. I've tried to stop using the phrase college, and I'm sort of trying to stop using the phrase higher education. I'm using the lovely phrase post-secondary education and training to describe this universe that we're really talking about. But the question of how much the existing institutions own that process versus new providers is, to me, the story of the next decade. So anyway, how do you want to...
And you think about all the structures that spring up around majors to, sort of wall them in. I personally think majors have outlived their usefulness and should shrink back to a tiny fraction of what they are. I mean, I think that mastery of a subject is part of what students get out of a good college experience. But the world is interdisciplinary. The world doesn't recognize those boundaries. And I think, in general, they do more harm than good.
So I completely agree. I'm trying to think about the right analogy. So when many of us were kids, our parents wanted us to go do sports, not so much because we were going to be professional baseball players, but because it taught discipline and it taught team sports and all the rest of that. I think that's what a major is. A major is evidence that you have delved deeply in something and produced some rigorous material. I have a good friend who's a Google hiring manager, and in addition to sort of de-degreeing the application process and putting people in simulations to do the work, they just are mystified by the plethora of majors that people are bringing to the table. When I became president of Occidental, I wanted to meet with each department, and so I went to all the department meetings, and there was this very funny thing where people would leave a meeting of the philosophy department about 5 minutes early so that they could run over and get into the symbolic logic major meeting, and then they would run to the next meeting. And so there was this little parade of people who had so fragmented not only their intellectual lives, but the intellectual lives of students that it really was meaningless. So I think bigger overall chunks, and to Doug's point, then smaller units of learning that are measured and certified and available for.
Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan Gergo with AQ, and Ted, thank you for the shout out. Since we're at a conference arguably about robots taking over, I thought I'd ask a question about robots taking over. So we're all familiar with the futurists who believe that we're approaching a place where there will be far future jobs, and certainly the kinds of jobs that will be attractive or available to non-elite students graduating from non-elite institutions. It's a simple question. Are they wrong? And so we don't need to worry about it. There'll be plenty of jobs in the future, just jobs we don't know yet. Or are we approaching a real transformation in how we organize our time and our day? And given that so much of this panel has been operating on the assumption that higher ed is in the business of job prep, how do we hedge? Should we hedge against the risk that that assumption might be false?
Yeah, Daniel, maybe start there.
Great question, by the way. So I think there are parts of the world, and especially the US in Silicon Valley, where there's research going on to hedge for that. So I think the fundamental question is not just robots, it's more around throughout human history, human beings have been, you could say, the top or the most intelligent, species, right? And therefore, the most productive factor of production, right? So we want to invest in human beings because, they tend to produce. Now the question is, when you have AI, or you're probably referring to the singularity, when that moment happens and then you sort of have algorithms that can do the job much more efficiently. They don't need to sleep, they don't whine, they don't complain, they don't want any rights, they just do the job, right? What happens then, right? What do humans do? So there's already a few constructs out there. One of them is providing some kind of a basic income, which is you tax the productivity of AI and those industries developing those AIs, and those taxes come into some sort of a basic income for all individuals, right? So Ontario, I believe, is trying to test this out with 45 to 50K. In Silicon Valley, there's an accelerator called Y Combinator. They're pretty well known. So they're actually testing this out in Oakland as well, where they're giving individuals $45,000, just take it. And they're trying to see what they do with that over the course of several years. So there's already research going on to that.
Is it going to happen? I mean, that's, I think.
I believe so. I think, and maybe I'm biased because I'm more towards that side of the futurist trend. But I think it will happen. The question is when. It's not so much is it going to happen. If you look back, a lot of jobs have been replaced. We went through the industrialization revolution. We've gone through many different epochs. So this is just another one. And we need to figure out what happens then.
Other people want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an argument on both sides of that of that coin, so to speak. I mean, we've had roles displacement and replacement going on for hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution. Right. Does artificial intelligence ultimately break that in the sense that there are no more jobs to be had and we got to go to other models? Maybe. I don't see this honestly in the foreseeable future, because I do think that our level even of understanding of AI is still very much in the beginning of it. And maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I do have the fundamental belief that we will create other jobs that we at this point can't even think about.
I'm put in mind of Georgia Tech's experience with its computer science course, where the most popular teaching assistant was named Jill Watson, who actually was an AI, and was not only got the highest rankings from the entire class, but someone actually asked her out on a date. So, so there is something, so the good part of it is the idea that you could have 24/7 access and an expert knowledge base that would be available to students all the time. There's something very appealing about that because no school could provide that sort of scale of advising. I think we have a little bit of time to figure this out. I read a lot of science fiction, so I think about this a lot. But I think you can no longer think about the future of higher education without thinking about the future of work. So I totally agree with your premise. And to think about the future of work inevitably leads you to thoughts about inequality and what sort of world we want to live in. So I think it's going to be one of the most interesting philosophical, economic questions, facing us in the future.
You wanted to add
Yeah,
one
just a
really quick thing.
very quick counterpoint. The reason throughout human history we've been able to sort of have humans rescale is because up until today, even now, human beings are still the most efficient, the most intelligent, species, right? The question is, once you sort of, it's called AGI, artificial general intelligence and beyond, once neural nets and AI reach that level, then it is a very important question because, for example, if I'm in the military, I'm a general, I don't need to feed my soldiers, right? We're already deploying drones that are flying out. You don't need pilots anymore. So it is a change, right? And this would spread throughout, truck drivers who are driving. They're not going to complain. You don't need to store, the trucks are going to drive and they're much safer. Like driverless cars are more safer than human beings, right? Because they can react in milliseconds. Human beings cannot.
Bob.
The field that I'm in is one that's undergoing tremendous disruption. Robo-advisors. Okay, robo-advisors are great until there's a bear market, until markets aren't going up every day like they are now. Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics, behavioral finance. So we can develop artificial intelligence that makes better choices, but there still needs to be that counseling. At least in my field, there still needs to be that counseling. And I think the best thing that could happen in my field is a bear market. Now, I'm not asking for that because I'm approaching retirement and I definitely don't want that. But it's the combination. And I think that's the future of my field is a robo-advisor working with a human advisor.
Ted, real quick, and then next question in the back.
Good thing, Jonathan, this wasn't a provocative question. So very quickly, I think the other over historical time, the job replacement rate has been roughly one to one, and I think that's what we've been able to count on. I don't think that that's going to be the case here. I think it is going to be negative, and so I think two things are going to happen. There are going to be jobs that are going to require more technical skill and more higher education as a way of producing that, and I think that that's going to be good for our industry. The other thing that's happening, and you mentioned social work earlier, is that all of the numbers are projecting that the human-to-human things, social work, nursing, elementary school teaching, maybe teaching in higher ed, all of those are going to grow over time, which then I think my major takeaway is that we need to get smarter about thinking about what gets produced for whom, at what scale, bigger social problems than we've been comfortable dealing with about distribution of resources, and I think that that's going to be the transition point.
In the back, yeah. Come close, not. Yeah.
No?
No, I think.
Playground voice.
So you folks mentioned a lot of the big things like affordability, access, career placement, stackable credentials, and I guess my question is, and first-generation students, we have a vehicle in this country already that scale. It's open access, it's affordable. 10 million students go there annually. It is the conduit between. Sorry. So we have a vehicle already in this country in higher ed called community colleges. They are open access, they are affordable, they are the conduit
between pre-K to 12 and university/4-year degree higher ed, stackable credentials. And I guess my question is, it always seems that this is an overlooked, underutilized entity. So I guess my thought is, what is your folks' opinion on leveraging this vehicle for addressing some of these issues?
Well, I'll probably, they're not underfunded. I mean, they're not underutilized. We get 40 to 45% of students are in them, get their start there. So they're not really underutilized by students themselves. They are underfunded and stretched way too thin, have way too many missions to try and accomplish. So they are, I think they are not, we don't fund them as if, and they are not treated as if they are the most important institutions in this ecosystem, which they may well be, or they are certainly more important than I think they are, than politicians and the public give them credit for. So that's my short answer to, I don't think they're underutilized, but I think they have their issues. And Ted, do you want to jump in?
Sure, and you know, Anne lives this too. I think community colleges are an enormous opportunity for the country, and students think that they're an enormous opportunity for them too. But I think, you know, as I said off the cuff at the beginning, 100% of the people who start a community college program think that they're going to finish, and 15% do. We need to help community college succeed at that, both on the university transfer side and on the connection with the workforce side. I think it's an open opportunity for policymakers to be able to do that, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And so you see something like the state of Arizona deciding that it is simply going to wipe the community college budget away. That's not the way we get there.
Yeah, no, and they are. I mean, I think there's no question that they are. I mean, you're right that in a lot of these conversations, and a lot of conversations generally, they are, you know, largely ignored and left out, and that's shame on sort of this conversation. Anybody else want to? Andy, you want to?
I think Gail Mello from LaGuardia Community College is on a panel later today, and you won't find anyone more more visionary and outcomes oriented than Gail at Community College. That said, I think that that there are reasons why it's easier to experiment at community colleges, and so I think a lot of the ways that higher education is defended against innovation is a little bit looser at community college. So I would put a tremendous amount of focus in solving some of the issues that we've been talking about today, and I think some schools like LaGuardia are doing a really good job at that.
Yeah. Are there other comments, questions? Please raise hands if you have them. Seriously? Okay, here. Why don't you go?
Hi, my name is Seema Shah. I'm the Director of Tech and Innovation at LaGuardia Community College.
Wow. Hi, Seema.
On cue.
So thank you for both the question and for the props. We appreciate that. My question is really, you know, my role was conceptualized by our president to be incredibly industry-driven, to basically do not come to work every day, please be out there, please be talking to the employers, and really kind of shining the light on untapped talent in New York. What do you think we could do as community college professionals, career services professionals, around kind of encouraging employers to co-develop curriculum and to really get in the trenches with us? Because, you know, there's been a lot of conversation around this, you know, employment and all of that sorts of stuff. I think that it's seen as this, you know, education ends and then employment starts, but that's, you know, obviously not true. So what's the hook, or what's a good kind of selling point in terms of connecting, building that bridge much more from the beginning of like the student's application?
Yeah, maybe I can chime in, not, you know, rather as a large employer. I mean, we would love to have these kinds of connections with regard to the development of the curriculum. It is rare. The reality is, it's rare that in the locations that we have about, you know, 38 locations around the United States, so in various states and communities. It's very rare that community colleges proactively reach out. So my recommendation to you would be to reach out to local employers that have a, you know, significant employment base, and you know, and encourage them to have that discussion about the curriculum.
In my role for close to 3 years, and we've been doing it, and the employers that get it, but
right.
You know, New York's a really competitive market with, you know, the other academic institutions.
Yeah.
So I'd add one more sweetener, and maybe you already do this, which is to make this less abstract than it might otherwise be. And it's not just about curriculum development, but it's about, we're going to put 25 people into this program, and you get first dibs on the 25 when they come out the other way.
Yep.
I think for lots of employers, being able to securitize the talent pipeline is worth a lot to them. And no, nor even the abstract. We're going to have a program that looks like what you need, but we're going to have a program that is what you need.
Right.
And at the end, these graduates are going to work in your enterprise. Northeastern is doing this with GE right now, and there are a number of community colleges in Tennessee that also have them.
Ann?
The other thing that I worked on when I was working for the CUNY chancellor was inviting companies to have employees serve as faculty in the colleges. We have an instructional capacity gap in higher education for computer science. You just can't hire all the faculty that you need. So it has to be a combination of full-time faculty, online learning, and practitioners in the classroom. And even better, if employers will allow employees to teach students in their place of business, then you're killing two birds with one stone. You're not only increasing your instructional capacity with people who are actually doing it with workplace experience, but you're giving first-generation college students exposure to the world of work.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word. We're out of time. Wanted to offer thanks to Michael Hansen, Ted Mitchell, Ann Kirshner, Daniel Jamil, and Bob Johnson. Thank all of you. There's a good adult leisure panel in here. The next panel is on adult students, which will be led by the very capable Goldie Blumenstick. I want to encourage you to stick around for that. And I'm Doug Letterman, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Yeah, pleasure. So what's your favorite?
Pleasure. Good to see you.